Hi, my name is Marty. I am a 67-year-old professor of politics at Ithaca College and grew up in New York and came out at age 33.
Great. Hi, Marty. So this is Andrew from whatisyourgay.com, and just going to ask you a couple questions today and get your story. So you grew up in New York City. What was that like?
It was very conventional for a city experience, but probably pretty unconventional for most of the people watching this YouTube event. Very urban, very few trees, very much concrete, very much confined by space, very much in the shadow of the Williamsburg Bridge. So it was a distinctly urban experience. At first, in a community that was really a spillover from the Lower East Side of Manhattan. So it was an immigrant culture. It was a pretty poor community. It got rattled by urban change and by highway expansion. So most of us moved at the same time, basically, into the suburbs or further out into the city. And so my family and I moved to Queens when I was 13. And from there, my growing up was, I would say, not quite suburban, not centrally urban, but outer urban. More trees.
And do you come from a religious family?
I did, or conventionally, or an observant family. I don't think they were devotedly religious. I don't think they were pious. I think they were habitually and by learned experience within their religious roles. And so they were traditionally and conventionally Jewish, but I wouldn't say heavily ideologically so.
So could you tell me a little bit about your experience when you sort of came to terms with yourself as a gay man? You know, when did that take place? All that sort of.
Well, I always emphasize it took place gradually. That there was no sudden awareness. There was no aha moment. I tend to define it as being a pretty observant guy and being somebody who was included to my culture and my city and my and my Jewish community, and knowing who I was, but I thought I knew only the outer straight edges of a jigsaw puzzle. And it's as if I knew the outer edges without knowing those central, hard to identify pieces. And only when I came out in my early 30s did those central pieces basically fall into place. I think at some level I always knew, but I was really pretty closeted and through my early academic experiences, through my hiring here. Coming out at 33 means there's a lot of time lost.
And coming out in your early 30s, did you ever tell your parents, or?
I did. I felt the need to. I think things would have been very incomplete, and it wouldn't have been a full coming out without that. And it was not easy. It took some time. And they were both surprising. My father, I think, was more generous and accepting than I thought. And my mother was more horrified than I thought she would be. She was the tougher nut to crack. And I really hadn't thought that.
Yeah.
So I would have felt very incomplete in the whole process, not to have told my parents.
That's very similar to my experience in terms of my father was initially, accepting right off the bat, and it took my mother some more time to come to terms with it, which seems to not be the norm from what I've heard. Do you think, was your mother more religious? I know in my parents' case, my mother was more religious, and so coming from a Catholic background, it took her a little longer to.
No, she was actually more secular and more in the world, and that's why I was surprised. My father was more observant and more religious, and his family was certainly more religious, and I think he associated gay oppression very early with Jewish oppression, and the algorithm of that oppression was in his head, and he could make the act of the transfer in some ways more easily. And I think certainly in the period I was growing up, a great deal of gay identity was blamed on mothers. And so I think women of the post-war generation took that news in a particular cultural way that I still haven't quite figured out. But I think we do share that experience, and I think for reasons that in my case we weren't notably religious.
Over your lifetime, and especially growing up on the edges of Manhattan, let's say, the Stonewall Riots are obviously a huge marker in the timeline of gay history, I'll say. What was that like for you? Because at that age, we were discussing you were probably 27, so not quite at the point of coming out yet, but you know, as you said, gradually you were finding this out. Watching the Stonewall Riots, let's say from the closet.
From the closet.
How was that for you?
From the closet with some keyhole openings that I could peer out through. I was actually not in New York that week. I was in Washington, and so the news came to me through the Village Voice. Maybe 2 or 3 days later. The only paper that really published the news was The Voice, and frankly, I was thrilled. My heart went pity-pat, as most people's did. Those people are doing a lot, and this is taking place over so many days, and the event is escalating, and something big is going on, and it really does involve me in some way that I can't even fully articulate. I was very excited and pretty scared, and it felt very deranging in a very good way. It did feel liberating on the spot from Washington.
Great.
And by the way, I would add one more thing. Within a year and a half of Stonewall, I was here in Ithaca, and already in the shadow of some of the early fallout from Stonewall, because immediately some of the earlier places that organized were academic communities, and notably Columbia within New York, and notably, and very early in the game, Cornell.
Right.
And so when I moved into my apartment on Eddy Street in Ithaca, it was in the shadow of a gay protest already on the street. and that I was observing from the closeted position that I was still in.
What was that energy like? The feeling in the air, you know, with that all going on? Is it similar to sort of, you know, today we're on the cusp of, you know, gay marriage taking off? Is it similar in any sense, or was it a much different feel?
It was dangerous. It felt challenging in all kinds of ways. And of course, it was in the shadow of Vietnam. We're talking about 3 or 4 different revolutions that were concurrent. And so by the time we got around to the gay part of the revolution, the gunpowder was in the air already, profoundly around Vietnam, profoundly around feminism, profoundly around civil rights, profoundly around sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And so the gay part of the story really chugs into place rather late in the story. There's already clouds of disorientation and derangement, and it was great fun. And the gay part of it did feel particularly dangerous, particularly incendiary, particularly challenging. It was a different flavor of gunpowder and the general miasma.
Great.
But I think you have to notice the gay revolution comes reasonably late in the context of everything else.
Right.
It's not as if everything else was settled. Now,